it rolling, Bob?
Is it rolling, Bob?
Is it rolling, Bob?
Hi folks, and welcome to Bob Dylan, A Head Full of Ideas, Season 3. I'm Chris Gregory, and today we're going to look at one of Dylan's greatest songs, Desolation Row. So this is called Desolation Row, Beyond the Windows of the Sea. So we're going to begin with a quote. I is another. If the brass wakes the trumpet, it's not our fault. That's obvious to me. I witness the unfolding of my own thought. I watch it. I hear it. I make a stroke with the bow. The symphony begins in the depths or springs with a bound onto the stage. If the old imbeciles hadn't discovered only the false significance of self, we wouldn't have to now sweep away those millions of skeletons which have been piling up the products of their one-eyed intellect since time immemorial and claiming themselves to be the authors. That's a quote from Arthur Rimbaud, the 19th century French symbolist poet who is well known to have quite an influence on Bob Dylan. Desolation Row is a hard song to sing. It's undoubtedly one of Dylan's most profound, accomplished and ambitious compositions, full of poetic vitality, biting wit, unforgettable character sketches, literary and other allusions, distinctive rhymes and transcendent metaphors. The lyrics operate on many levels as a commentary on the crazy hypocrisies of the modern world, as a declaration of the existence of the counterculture, and as a literary manifesto. Despite its length, 11 minutes on its initial release, it has a clearly defined dramatic structure, including a clever framing device within which it proceeds to a quite beautifully expressive climax. It is arguably Bob Dylan's most original and complete work, a song which could only have come from the particular historical moment in which it was written, and yet which is also completely timeless and full of universal truths. Yet, as the many unsuccessful attempts at recording the song, now available on the bootleg series release The Cutting Edge, demonstrate, Dylan struggled at first to place his tirade of astonishing lyrics in an appropriate musical setting. Although he has performed it many hundreds of times over his subsequent career, he's arguably never discovered an alternative arrangement that really matches up to the sheer verbal and emotional power of the final Highway 61 take. In 1965, as Dylan was going through the most profound musical change of his career, having made his name as a solo folk singer with a social conscience, a kind of updated version of his hero Woody Guthrie, he was then engaged in his highly controversial switch to becoming a rock star. While the previous record, Bringing It All Back Home, had begun the process, it was still divided between acoustic and electric sides. Now Dylan was attempting to cut an entirely electric album. Yet somehow Desolation Row didn't quite fit the mould. For one thing, it has 10 six-line verses and lasts around 11 minutes. It takes the form of a traditional ballad with many verses centred on a repeated musical pattern, with no bridge section or real chorus, although each verse ends dramatically with the title phrase. In many ways, it could be seen as a successor to 1963's apocalyptic A Hard Rain's Are Gonna Fall, a song which, perhaps surprisingly, later worked very effectively in a rocked-up form. It's no exaggeration to claim that at this point in his career, Dylan was actually in the process of reinventing the medium of songwriting itself. He'd immersed himself not only in old ballads and blues, but also in the entire canon of Western literature, from Homer to Shakespeare to the Romantics, the Modernists, and the Beat poets. He was also enthralled to Elvis Presley, Little Richard, Buddy Holly, and lately the Beatles. All of these influences now poured into his writing. But what kind of song is Desolation Row? Despite its musical form, with its stream of surreal images and eclectic cultural references, it can hardly be called a folk ballad, despite the fact that it's kind of based on one, I suppose. It also has a basic rhythmic core which can set heads nodding and feet tapping. In many ways, it is a rock and roll song, yet to carry it off as a lyrical and rhythmic tour de force requires a particular effort of will. On the album's bizarre sleeve notes, Dylan states that the record consists of not so much songs, but exercises in tonal breath control. It's almost as if to perform this epic recitation, he has to take one extremely deep breath. The rest of the performance is a kind of long exhalation, which can only be achieved with intense concentration and focus. The singer needs to have extraordinary control of his diction and phrasing in order to make this convincing. Not surprisingly, there have been very few cover versions of notes of this song. A few people have tried, but very few have succeeded. The key to the success of the recording on Highway 61 was the addition of second acoustic guitarist Charlie McCoy, who later played with Dylan on Blonde on Blonde, on Wesley Harding and Nashville Skyline. Various attempts to record the song with electric guitars, drums and even piano proved unsuccessful. Finally, the decision was made to go back to an acoustic guitar-led recording. The addition of McCoy's brightly inventive fills, and in particular that little rhythmic flourish that comes at the end of each verse, really drive the song along. Russ Savaka's low-key bass playing also helps anchor the sound. The result is a highly spirited performance, transforming a song which could be seen as doomy and depressing into a triumphantly uplifting hymn to the new rising consciousness of the 1960s. The Highway 61 album gives voice to this new perspective, for which Dylan had become the most articulate avatar. The forceful and imaginative, Like a Rolling Stone, which opens the album, celebrates this consciousness through what appears to be a personal put-down of a spoiled rich girl, but which turns into a mighty declaration of intellectual and spiritual independence. Tombstone Blues is a merciless satire on American cultural institutions. Ballad of a Thin Man is a devastating attack on the narrow-minded individual who just cannot grasp what this new way of looking at life entails. The title song mocks the way that conventional religion is linked to warmongering. Queen Jane approximately explores issues of sexual identity, while, just like Tom Thumb's Blues, outlines the effect of various mind-expanding drugs through the personas of Mexican prostitutes. Just 3 years earlier, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, the world had held its breath on the brink of destruction. Meanwhile, Martin Luther King had expressed his dream, Kennedy had been shot, the US Army had been deployed in huge numbers in the unforgiving jungles of Vietnam, and the Beatles had revolutionized American rock music. In the eyes of the burgeoning youth movement, the world was being run by leaders who were literally insane, and every cultural shibboleth could now be challenged. Hard Rain had been a direct, if highly poetic, evocation of defiance of this madness in the face of an apocalypse. But now the discourse had shifted. It was necessary now to examine not just the mentality of war, but the sickness of human culture and the institutions that had brought the world to that precipice. A straightforward statement, like Barry Maguire's rather inane hit Eve of Destruction, or even Dylan's polemical With God on Our Side, would no longer cut the mustard. Desolation Row has frequently been compared to T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, which examined the shifting of consciousness that occurred after the horrors of the First World War. Dylan even name-checks Eliot in the song. But perhaps a more appropriate comparison is with Allen Ginsberg's Howl, the visionary beat poet's brilliantly extended Whitman-esque rant against the shallowness of American post-war culture. Howl famously begins, "I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness," which in the light of the anti-establishment explosion of the 1960s turned out to be extremely prophetic, as figures like Jim Morrison, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Brian Wilson, Brian Jones, Syd Barrett and Peter Green experienced psychological burnout or early tragic deaths. The songs on the Highway 61 album are each placed in dreamlike or perhaps nightmarish scenarios in which a whole range of fantastical characters, from Miss Lonely to Napoleon in rags to Mr. Jones to Sweet Melinda, the goddess of gloom, appear and disappear just as rapidly. Some of these, like Ma Rainey, Beethoven, the King of the Philistines, or Paul Revere, are genuine historical figures. Others, like the Commander-in-Chief, Queen Jane, or the Sword Swallower, seem to be satirical representations of real people. This cinematic technique of allowing characters to appear and then rapidly cutting away from them reaches its apotheosis in Desolation Row, which presents a long cavalcade of real historical figures and famous literary archetypes. Dylan places these characters, many of which are clearly symbolic, in bizarre and unfamiliar contexts. Despite their brief cameos, each one appears to take on a life of their own. These characters could be called living symbols. Huge numbers of words have been written, of course, in the many analyses of this song. Commentators have attempted to identify each character's symbolic meaning, as if the song is some kind of puzzle that the listener is supposed to decode. But Dylan's characters take on a life of their own. Their interactions can, and of course have been, interpreted in many different ways. They're set up to be delightfully ambiguous. Dylan mixes a scathing critique of contemporary morals and beliefs with a tone of dark and ironic humour. I was listening to a very rare bootleg of a 1965 Dylan show the other day, and it's very strange that when the song was first performed to audiences who never heard it before, because the album had yet to be released, they actually reacted by laughing as the witty rhymes and cutting lines poured out. Another misunderstanding of Desolation Row, which many commentators, attempting to place it in its literary context or justify it as a serious work, have said that it's a modernist text. But although, like Beckett's seminal modernist text Waiting for Godot, it delights in comic absurdity and ambiguity, and like The Wasteland, it is crammed with allusions, it steadfastly refuses to resign itself to the ultimate sense of hopelessness that such modernist texts convey. Dylan's references to the modernists themselves, who actually appear as characters in the song, are decidedly mocking. Although to some extent he embraces modernism's complex worldview and uses some of its literary tropes and techniques, whereas modernist texts like Joyce's Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake are deliberately constructed to be difficult, Desolation Row ultimately conveys a message of hope and positivity. Ultimately, the song conveys what could be called a romanticist message, in that it focuses on the power of the imagination and uses certain Gothic tropes. I think, some critics have banged on a lot about T.S. Eliot and The Wasteland in order to try and justify themselves. But anyway, we'll talk about that a bit later. Just as Dylan is pushing songwriting to his limits here, he's also simultaneously redefining modern poetry. He uses music, rhyme and rhythm to return poetic expression to its status as a popular art form. In doing so, he creates a template which so many singer-poets, from Joni Mitchell, Leonard Cohen, Paul Simon, Richard Thompson, many others, would follow. As Ginsberg, by now not only a friend of Dylan, but an absolutely devoted, almost obsessed admirer, recognised. This concept of the role of poetry had been one which he and the other beat poets had conceptualised in the 1950s. But their impassioned poetry readings to jazz backings had never reached the mass popularity of Dylan and his successors. Well, they're probably reading in coffee bars, aren't they? Whereas Dylan, of course, by now is actually playing to stadiums. In Desolation Row, Dylan's use of dream narratives and fantastical scenarios also recalls the work of Blake, Shelley, Keats, and the other romantic poets. He takes complex, elusive, and razor-sharp poetry into the homes of millions, creating art as resonant, universal and timeless as that of Shakespeare, to whom he quite naturally alludes in the song. Both the first and the final verses of Desolation Row form a kind of frame for its fantastical narratives, through which the action in the verses is filtered. The events of the song appear to take place within one evening as night closes in. We begin with some of Dylan's most evocative and mysterious opening lines. They're selling postcards of the hanging, they're painting the passports brown. The alliterative P's here already have the effect of pushing the narrative, there's another P, pushing the narrative forward positively and engaging the listener. The next lines, the beauty parlour is filled with sailors, the circus is in town, are similarly beguiling, with the P's now sliding into the more reassuring S sounds. Dylan is very fond of alliteration. Already, Dylan has built up a remarkable series of resonant visual images. The opening lines suggest a world in which rampant commercialism and crass bureaucracy has run riot. The first line has been linked to a real-life event, the horrific lynching of two black men in Duluth, which is Dylan's birthplace in the 1920s. This may well be where Dylan got the inspiration for the line from. Postcards produced to celebrate the event were actually sold at the time, but Dylan may also be referring to the way that violence is routinely commodified and arguably celebrated through the mass media. In just 6 words, he paints a picture of a very sick world. The next line already takes us into more surreal territory, as the authorities apparently try to wipe out the proof of identity of those who are marginalised in modern society. The succeeding lines paint a graphic picture of a world which is characterised as a kind of mad circus, in which normal reality is reversed. They counteract the repressive nature of the opening lines, taking us into the song's vivid dream world. Dylan's very fond of using circuses as metaphors. He also seems to like the sound of the word circus itself. In Mr. Tambourine Man, his protagonist is circled by the circus sands. In Ballad of a Thin Man, includes a parade of circus freaks and performers. It may be that all the events and characters in the song are actually part of a circus. This, it seems, is how Dylan views the modern world, as a fantastical show full of performers desperately trying to impress us. Then we are introduced to the first character. The narrative tone shifts to that of a circus barker who declares, "Here comes the blind commissioner." This person appears to be some kind of generic authority figure, but he is also a circus performer. We are told that he is in some kind of trance and that one hand is tied to the tightrope walker. It seems that he has been made to walk the tightrope, obviously a very perilous task for a blind person to be asked to do. But in case we have any sympathy for him, Dylan undercuts this with vicious humour. "The other is in his pants," he says, which may be a sexual reference, but could also imply that this official is trousering any profits from the circus. So he may be a symbol of blind directionlessness, but corrupt authority at the same time. Or maybe he's just playing with himself. Anyway, the concluding lines, "And the riot squad, they're restless, they need somewhere to go, as Lady and I look out tonight," from Desolation Row, continue the I alliteration. The line from the line about the tightrope walker. The notion of a restless riot squad now pushes the narrative into a more socio-political direction. The inference being that the squad is basically a bunch of thugs spoiling for a fight. In the context of the 1960s civil rights movement and the viciously racist policing that protesters were often met with, this seems particularly apposite. So far, we've been given a picture of a topsy-turvy, corrupt world, elements of which are nevertheless presented as popular entertainment to the brainwashed population. It's important to note, however, that the world that's being described isn't Desolation Row itself. Here we see the narrator and his lady looking at this mad world from that place. This will be consistent throughout the song. Desolation Row is the place of refuge. the only place where sanity and true humanity can be found. This may seem somewhat contradictory, but the world being described here, whatever its drawbacks, is hardly desolate. The term desolation can be strongly identified with the notion of being beat, which Kerouac, Ginsberg and others advanced as a measure of the degradation and madness they felt they had to put themselves through to truly break away from the mindset of conventional society. Kerouac's stream of consciousness novel, Desolation Angels, had recently been published in 1965, and Dylan, ever the magpie, lifted several lines from it in the song. Desolation Row is, of course, a state of mind rather than a physical location. It represents a place which is not necessarily easy to get to. To reach it, one must, perhaps, be ready to subject oneself to a desolate existence. I suppose a beat existence, perhaps by pushing oneself to mental extremes. But it appears to be the only place from one can really appreciate just how twisted and crazy the real world has become. The next 8 verses introduce us to a cavalcade of characters who may or may not double as circus performers. Dylan sums up each of their qualities succinctly with mordant wit. We begin in the world of fairy tales with Cinderella, in a story which advances the idea that true human worth, in the form of the honest but put upon servant girl, must triumph over wealth and narcissism, as epitomised by the heroine's ugly sisters. But the character who we meet here certainly doesn't seem to be waiting for Prince Charming or expecting any magical transformations. We're told that she seems so easy, and that in a delicately, if rather suggestively executed turn of phrase, "It takes one to know one," she smiles. And then in an absolutely brilliant visual transformation, we hear that, and then she puts her hands in her back pocket, Betty Davis style. This is a modern, liberated Cinderella, presumably dressed in jeans. She seems so easy, may suggest a woman who is particularly sexually active. The actress Betty Davis, who specialised in powerful female roles in which she displayed an independent sexuality, really did have the habit of putting her hands in her back pocket. It's really true, actually. If you look at pictures of Betty Davis on Google, you'll find her with her hands in her back pocket. Suddenly, Romeo, who seems to be a rather pathetic figure, appears, apparently in pursuit of Cinderella. In comes Romeo, he's moaning, "You belong to me, I believe." This actually may be a reference to "You Belong to Me," a moving, if rather lachrymose ballad, first recorded by Joe Stafford in 1952, and later by Dean Martin, Patsy Cline and many others. Dylan recorded his own version for the soundtrack of Natural Born Killers in 1992. But, as is pointed out to the anguished lover, he is in the wrong place. Naturally, he should be pursuing Juliet, not Cinderella, of course. Yeah, there's no play called Romeo and Cinderella, is there? Yeah. The verse ends ominously, and the only sound that's left after the ambulances go is Cinderella sweeping up on Desolation Row. We may speculate that Romeo, who of course kills himself in Shakespeare's play, whoops, spoiler, sorry, I'm sure you knew that, has committed suicide. Or perhaps he's been removed to an asylum. In any case, Cinderella carries on regardless. She's protected from the vagaries of this shifting dream world because she lives on Desolation Row. But the clearly confused lover, Romeo, appears to have wandered into the wrong narrative entirely, again indicating that these characters exist in a world where everything is slightly askew. We now see that the sun has gone down and that the evening's revelries are about to begin, but something in the universe is out of joint. We hear that the moon is almost hidden, the stars are beginning to hide, as if these natural features are somehow alive but are hiding themselves away, as if in shame. The fortune-telling lady has taken all her things inside, suggests that any conventional prediction of the future is likely to be as accurate as an apocalyptic event is about to occur. The following, all except for Cain and Abel and the Hunchback of Notre Dame, everybody's making love or else expecting rain, is tantalizingly ambiguous. You really do have to say Notre Dame in an American accent to make that rhyme. It seems that the population of the world of the song are either frantically taking their last chances to make love before the end comes, or just sitting around hopelessly, waiting for it to happen. More strange juxtapositions of characters from different origins are then introduced. The biblical Cain and Abel are lumped together with Victor Hugo's eponymous bell ringer. In Genesis, Cain and Abel are the sons of Adam and Eve, and Cain becomes the first murderer and he kills his brother before being exiled to walk the earth to atone for this perhaps unforgivable sin. Quasimodo, the hunchback, is another tragic figure who is powerless to save Esmeralda, the girl he is besotted with, from the gallows. In his rage, he throws the Archdeacon Frollo, who was also in love with the girl, from the tower of the cathedral to his death. The implication here appears to be that these characters are somehow detached from the world of the song, being so bound up in their own tragic lives that they will not be able to participate in the coming festivities. The final lines of the verse, however, introduce another biblical figure, the Good Samaritan, who in the New Testament saves a dying man without prejudice when others pass him by, and who is happily preparing himself for tonight's carnival on Desolation Row, an event to which Cinderella and Romeo have not been invited. But our grown-up Cinderella, however, does not seem bothered that she will not be going to the ball. Each of the next three verses is based around a single symbolic character. First of all, we meet Ophelia, Hamlet's doomed girlfriend, who commits suicide in Shakespeare's play after Hamlet kills her father Polonius by accident. This is one of the song's more detailed character studies. Again, the action described occurs in a dreamlike scenario in which the conventional attributes of the characters are mixed up. Ophelia is first seen neath the window, which is where Romeo should perhaps have been in the last verse, serenading Juliet. The narrator expresses concern for her. For her, I feel so afraid, which is followed by the extraordinary statement, on her 22nd birthday, she already is an old maid. Shakespeare infers that Hamlet and Ophelia have had sex. As the apparently crazed Hamlet rejects her, she can no longer marry, according to the morality of the time, because she's no longer a virgin. What follows is an extraordinary set of images which can be read in a number of ways. We're told that, to her, death is quite romantic and that she wears an iron vest. It may be true that the Ophelia figure here is, like the earlier Cinderella, actually a modern woman. She appears to represent a figure who, because of her devotion to the constraints of the iron vest of sexually repressive organised religion, can never enter the sanctuary of Desolation Row. She considers herself a sinner who cannot be saved and who will eventually, like Romeo, take her own life. But in one of the song's most remarkable lines, we are given the icily ambiguous, her profession's her religion, her sin is her lifelessness. This seems to refer to the conversation between Hamlet and Ophelia, in which he, pretending to be mad, tells her to go away from him and get thee to a nunnery. This is usually taken to indicate that Hamlet's cruelly rejecting her and suggesting that she is nothing but a whore, nunnery being contemporary slang for a brothel. Thus, Ophelia, as portrayed here, represents the opposite of Cinderella, a woman who cannot break down the barriers of sexual repression and guilt that the established church has erected around her. Yet the final lines of the verse indicate that she patiently waits for God's forgiveness, with her eyes fixed on Noah's great rainbow, the Old Testament sign of the covenant between God and man. She is continually tempted to peek into the supposedly sinful and immoral Desolation Row. Dylan's treatment of Ophelia seems to suggest that she represents the way in which conventional Christianity, with its strong emphasis on sexual repression and condemnation of female sexuality, prevents its victims from entering the more liberated and enlightened state that Desolation Row represents. It's this institutionalized repression that creates the state of lifelessness that Ophelia is trapped in. The highly resonant phrase, her sin is her lifelessness, is borrowed from Kerouac's Desolation Angels, representing the state of mind in which the Beat poets fought passionately against. The next verse concerns another symbolic figure in the person of Albert Einstein, the most famous scientist of the 20th century and a highly enlightened figure whose very name has become a byword for genius. Yet the great man is shown here as being reduced to the level of a street beggar who is disguised as Robin Hood and is accompanied by his friend, a jealous monk. Perhaps this friend is Robin Hood's sidekick, Friar Tuck, although the fact that the monk is called jealous appears to be another personification of repressive organised religion. In a wonderful collocation of words, Dylan describes Einstein as looking so immaculately frightful as he bummed a cigarette. What an image that is. Frightful and immaculate are supposedly opposing terms. The suggestion seems to be that Einstein is extremely proud of his down-at-heel state. He's dropped out of conventional society and become a kind of outlaw. Yet he's certainly lowered himself into extreme degradation. He went off sniffing drain pipes and reciting the alphabet. In a last darkly comic twist, Dylan's narrator shares with us that you would not think to look at him, but he was famous long ago for playing electric violin on Desolation Row. Within the degraded world that's being described, a celebrated prodigy is reduced to the status of a hobo, grubbing around for scraps. Actually, Einstein really did play the violin as a hobby, although Dylan's insertion of electric here seems to reflect his own current transformation via electric instruments. On one level, this Einstein outlaw figure might be seen as Dylan himself, a groundbreaking genius who dresses like a bum. From here on, the song takes some darker turns. The subject of the following verse, Dr. Filth, who keeps his world inside of a leather cup, is distinctly scary, a personification of the perverted science which dominates the world under observation from Desolation Row. The image of a leather cup may suggest the testicular protection device worn by American footballers. In any case, it seems that the dirty doctor has control of a world which is dangerously shrunken. The doctor himself seems to be some kind of combination of Sigmund Freud and Joseph Mengele. We hear that his sexless patients would like to destroy the doctor's world, but are presumably powerless to do so. The doctor is assisted by a nurse with equally dubious morality, memorably put down by the narrator as some local loser. In a scathingly surreal line, she is said to be in charge of the cyanide hole, which may be some kind of device through which people's minds are poisoned. But the nurse also controls the doctor as she keeps the cards that read, "Have mercy on his soul." She is in charge, it seems, of his potential chances for salvation. Both of these medical figures are said to blow rather hopelessly on penny whistles, which those of us in Desolation Row can hear if we lean our heads out far enough. The attempts by these sick and twisted characters to express themselves are thin and reedy. In this verse, the doctor and the nurse are the opposite of what they are supposed to be. They are sadistic killers rather than healers. Viewed from Desolation Row, the contrary nation of this vision of the world now becomes clear. As the night wears on, preparations for some kind of celebration continue. We're told that the ubiquitous they are getting ready for the feast. Now we meet the Phantom of the Opera, another famous literary character whose story's been adapted many times on screen and in print. Originally published as a novel in 1911 by Gaston Leroux, the tragic story of its doomed protagonist, who the world will not accept because of physical deformity, has been adapted in a number of films and stage musicals. As a character, the Phantom thus resembles the Hunchback of Notre Dame, or Dame, I suppose, both of which haunt famous buildings in Paris. Here is described in another line taken from Desolation Angels as looking like the perfect image of a priest. Another apparently paradoxical image recalling the earlier description of Einstein the bum as immaculately frightful. It seems that the Phantom has been placed in charge of organising the upcoming celebrations, which turn out to consist of nothing less than a ritual murder of another famous legendary figure. They're spoon-feeding Casanova to get him to feel more assured. In an earlier version, Casanova is being force-fed the boiled guts of birds, which doesn't sound very appealing, does it? This gruesome image might fit more with the grand guignol setting, but the change of lyric is more subtle, indicating that the famous lover is now being set up by unknown shady figures. The song's ubiquitous they, so that they can kill him with self-confidence after poisoning him with words. Casanova was a real historical figure who, quite possibly highly exaggerated memoir, claimed he had bedded thousands of women. He has since become a symbol of male sexuality, the ultimate romantic, and that's how he's kind of functioning here, really. Now we see him being subsumed by the powers that be. His sexual indulgences have brought about his ruin. As the Phantom angrily tells the skinny girls, presumably some of Casanova's conquests, who have come to visit him, "Get out of here if you don't know. Casanova is just being punished for going to Desolation Row." Thus, Desolation Row is associated with the sexual freedom that Casanova seeks. Images of repression build up in the powerful 8th verse. We now reach the climax of the evening's entertainment. Dylan's words drip with bile. At midnight, all the agents and the superhuman crew come out and round up everyone that knows more than they do. This gotta say, is my favourite verse. This paints a picture of a totalitarian state. In using the word superhuman, Dylan hints that these goons may, like the Nazis, consider themselves to be members of a superior race. But the ironic placing of the word crew shifts the image into a comic book scenario. The killer line here is the last of the four, a brilliantly compressed comment that implies that the repression being handed out is directed at intellectuals, very much as it has been in many totalitarian states. But this scene, with its comic book connotations, does not appear to be taking place in some far-off land. It's happening in contemporary America, from which Desolation Row provides the only shelter. In this context, the street violence that plagued the US in the 1960s during the battles over civil rights, for which Dylan himself had written the most potent anthems, is a constant backdrop. But in this scenario which is unfolding, state repression is now spreading to all of those who oppose it. The tortures that are now recounted leave us in little doubt as to the power of those repressive forces, and they bring them to the factory where the heart attack machine is strapped across their shoulders. The bland ambiguity of the terms "the factory" and "the heart attack machine" is thrown into relief by the way Dylan uses enjambment so sharply. And then the kerosene, he draws, is brought down from the castles by insurance men who go, check to see that nobody is escaping to Desolation Row. The pointed use of kerosene to link the lines together recalls Ray Bradbury's dystopian satire Fahrenheit 451, in which all books are burned by kerosene-wielding operatives. The references to castles and insurance men are direct allusions to Franz Kafka's terrifying dystopian tales of repressive state bureaucracy. The way Dylan balances terror and sly wit in this verse is quite masterful. When the song was later shortened for live performances, this verse was always retained. It's Dylan's most powerfully cynical indictment of the straight world. Here the insurance men, bland, besuited bureaucrats, attempt to reduce the range of human experience and place individuals in fear of living life to the full. In this song there is only one place in the modern world where it is possible to do this, and that, of course, is Desolation Row. Now that the world that the Row's protagonists are looking into has revealed itself to be vicious and controlling, the narrator takes a step back and comments wryly on the state of the modern world. "Praise be to Nero's Neptune," he exclaims. "The Titanic sails at dawn, and everybody's shouting, 'Which side are you on?'" The Emperor Nero has the reputation of being insane and was famously said to have fiddled while Rome burned. A coin has been discovered with Nero's head on one side and a representation of the harbour of Ostia on the other. Prominent in the picture is a statue of Neptune, the god of the sea. It may be that the world is being pushed towards destruction, perhaps by another great flood, on a symbolic level anyway, despite the earlier presence of Noah's great rainbow. The Titanic is, of course, doomed. Here it may stand for the whole of human civilization, driven by Neptune's winds to an inevitable end. Meanwhile, the passengers are fighting and arguing about political ideologies. Dylan's choice of the phrase Which Side Are You On is especially relevant as it's the title of one of America's most famous protest songs, written in 1931 by Labour activist Florence Reese. Later recorded by Pete Seeger and many others, it was still a staple of Greenwich Village folk singers when Dylan arrived there. It is, however, a rather crass song which lacks the subtle nuances of Dylan's own protest material. The juxtaposition of these elements throws the futility of the protesters' song into sharp light here. Throughout Desolation Row there have been hints that an apocalyptic destruction of the nightmarish world it describes is imminent. The utter pointlessness of adopting a political position in such circumstances is made clear. Another brief couplet demonstrates how famous writers are also seen to be wasting their time in pointless textual disputes which will be equally useless in preventing the cataclysm to come. Dylan tells us that Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot are fighting in the captain's tower. Here we see two leading exponents of modernist literature locked in a pointless dispute. The captain's tower appears to refer to the tower in Dublin in which the opening chapters of James Joyce's Ulysses are set. The implication seems to be that the over-intellectualized linguistic puzzles of such modernist works will prove to be useless for preventing the coming disaster. But then the tone suddenly shifts. While the intellectuals fight their pointless battles, we hear that calypso singers laugh at them while fishermen hold flowers. The calypso singers and fishermen live in a beautiful world of fantasy, between the windows of the sea where lovely mermaids flow, and nobody has to think too much about Desolation Row. Although Desolation Row appears to suggest that the coming apocalypse is imminent, the notion that this will be a nuclear war, which Dylan had railed against in his earlier, more prosaic protest song, Let Me Die in My Footsteps, and of course his visionary Hard Rains Are Gonna Fall, there's only one possible interpretation. The narrator's series of dream visions also suggests that a revolution of consciousness may be coming, inspired by the denizens of Desolation Row and perhaps by those loving fishers of men accompanied by the lovely mermaids. In the meantime, escaping to this isolated place appears to be the only way to stay sane. A verse-long harmonica break separates this from the final verse, which completes the framing device. Now Dylan reverts to a more detached, prosaic voice of an I narrator, giving us what at first seems to be rather trivial and irrelevant information. I received a letter yesterday about the time the doorknob broke. If you ask me what I was doing, was that some kind of joke? It seems that the narrator is referring to a moment when he was trapped in some unspecified room. But the last two of the 4 lines appears to ask a somewhat pointless question. Of course he was trying to escape. It now appears that all the previous action of the song made up the content of this letter. But then the narrator turns everything around. All these people that you mentioned, I know them, they're quite lame. I had to rearrange their faces and give them all another name. This adds a whole new dimension to the song. It may be that the parade of mythical, literary or historical figures we've been presented with are mere ciphers for the actual people that the two correspondents know. But the narrator has decided to mythologize them by giving them the names of famous representative figures. Finally, he instructs us not to send him any more letters, not unless you mail them from Desolation Row. So only by embracing this desolation, this state of being beat, can true communication occur. On a political level, this appears to involve transcending failed ideologies. On a personal level, true intellectual and spiritual freedom can only be achieved by removing oneself steadfastly from the dominant morals and values of the culture. It's really not surprising that Dylan was held up as being some kind of prophet by the alternative society, because in this text he lays out the whole thing, really. He lays out the whole idea of leaving mainstream society and being somewhere else, not necessarily in a physical sense, but in a mental sense. Desolation Row is thus, without a doubt, one of the key texts, arguably the key text of the 1960s counterculture. It creates an image of a place to which those who are horrified by the violence, cruelty, and religious and political hypocrisy in the world can retreat. The row is a strange place in which reality is constantly shifting, while the nature of that reality is necessarily ambiguous. It's a location in which poetic metaphor and dream images are reality, and from which a new world free from terror, repression, bigotry, and violence, rather like perhaps Coleridge's Xanadu, can be created. Entering it may not be easy. We may not even know we are there when we get there. But it is vital that in order to become a creative artist, rather than a mere entertainer, one must embrace personal desolation. In other words, to reach into the darkest depths of one's soul. That's a place where heroes look like hobos and ordinary people turn into mythical characters in order to unleash the power of one's imagination on the world. Right, so that's that. That was quite long, wasn't it? As to be expected. My intention in writing this stuff is to really try to go deep into these songs, which you've probably gathered by now if you're still listening, because I do think that in the past songs like this have been extremely misinterpreted, tied down to one specific meaning. And I think it's very important to look at all the different possible meanings that are actually going on here. So yeah, we said Desolation Row is a kind of summation of the counterculture, but it's also about artistic creativity. It's also a statement that in order to be a properly creative artist, you've got to become beat again. You know, you've got to embrace this desolation. You've got to live in that garret, I suppose, although I'm sure Dylan wasn't living in a garret at the time, in order to detach oneself from the world. And the characters that appear in the song are kind of stereotyped characters that represent different aspects of that world. So in the end, the song has this kind of romantic vision. It's one must go deep into one's imagination in order to be a poet. And this again is perhaps another statement that Dylan's making about why he's stopped writing purely political songs. Although you could certainly argue that in many ways Desolation Row is the most political song that he ever wrote. It's possibly also the most personal song that he ever wrote. There's no doubt it's a masterpiece. That's the end of this for today, and I'll be back with perhaps a slightly shorter reading next time, and I'll see you then. Please do subscribe and send me some comments. It'd be very interesting to hear some comments on this. Okay, see you then. Bye bye.
Is it rolling, Bob?
Is it rolling, Bob?
Is it rolling, Bob?